Melody Hargrave was the kind of woman whose silence spoke volumes. Born in a quiet suburb of Seattle, her childhood was anything but peaceful. Her mother, Eloise, battled bipolar disorder and left when Melody was just 5, and her father, a brilliant but absent-minded professor, drowned himself in academia to cope with the void. It was her older sister, Vanessa, 10 years her senior, who practically raised her, taking odd jobs as a teenager to keep them fed, clothed, and emotionally afloat. Melody grew up reading psychology books the way other kids read comics. She was fascinated by the mind, by healing, by the invisible wounds no one talked about. Her dream wasn't fame, riches, or luxury. It was simple but profound, to create a safe space for children struggling with trauma. Her love for art therapy, soft music, and gentle speech made her a favorite among her peers during grad school at Northwestern University. But underneath her calming voice and serene smile was a woman who had survived storms no one knew she'd weathered. Melody Hargrave was not broken, but her pieces were arranged with wisdom, and her scars were laced with empathy. Liam Callahan was everything Melody was not, and yet, somehow, everything she had once imagined in the man she'd marry. Born and raised in Boston, Liam had the sharp edges of the East Coast, confident, fast-talking, and unapologetically ambitious. His mother, Florence, left when he was 9, walking out one bitter winter morning and never returning. His father, Gerald Callahan, a former U.S. Marine, raised Liam with rigid discipline and high expectations, often reminding him that men didn't cry, and weakness was for the defeated. Liam learned early to excel at everything: sports, academics, debate, networking. He became a star speaker in college and built his identity on charisma and the ability to turn any room in his favor. But beneath the tailored suits and sharp smile was a boy who'd never heard his father say, "I'm proud of you." His obsession with proving himself meant he didn't rest. He built goals atop goals, and his dream was to launch a technology firm that would disrupt the consulting world. Emotions, therapy, and vulnerability were foreign languages to him. His love life, until now, had been a string of shallow connections. But all of that changed the night he met Melody. They met at a Northwestern University alumni networking mixer in Chicago, one of those buzzing, polished events hosted at a glass-walled hotel rooftop. Melody had no intention of attending. She hated crowds. But her best friend, Kara, begged her to come just for the view. Meanwhile, Liam was a guest speaker at the event, having just landed his second round of angel investment for what would become KlSSED. Melody stood in the corner, sipping cucumber water and scanning the skyline through the window, when Liam's voice, confident and clever, echoed through the mic. Their first interaction was anything but romantic. Liam made a dismissive joke about therapists being just paid friends, and Melody, without looking up, responded, "And sometimes analysts are just people trying to make sense of their fathers." It stunned him. She had pierced him without even knowing it. Intrigued and disarmed, Liam introduced himself. They spent the rest of the evening in conversation that bounced from cognitive empathy to artificial intelligence. The connection wasn't rushed or dramatic, it was steady, like two people walking across a tightrope together in perfect rhythm. And in that moment, without either of them knowing, their fates had silently intertwined. The months following that rooftop encounter in Chicago were marked by late-night conversations, carefully crafted emails, and phone calls that started as casual check-ins and ended with confessions of childhood memories and unspoken fears. Melody, cautious by nature, refused to let her heart run wild. She'd seen what happened when people trusted too quickly. Her own father was a walking testament to emotional absence behind gentle smiles. Liam, on the other hand, found himself drawn in ways he hadn't anticipated. For the first time, he wasn't trying to impress someone, he was trying to understand them. Their friendship became the anchor in the storm of their separate lives. When Melody flew back to Seattle, Liam started visiting more frequently, claiming investor meetings as excuses. Their bond was forged in bookstores, over street tacos and dim alleys, and silent walks through museums. Melody introduced him to mindfulness and the beauty of slowing down. Liam introduced her to risk, excitement, and the art of believing in one's voice. Still, they never labeled what they had, perhaps because they were both afraid of breaking it. In those early stages, it wasn't love that kept them together, it was respect, curiosity, and the quiet recognition that they were two damaged souls finding solace in one another. In the background of Melody's blossoming connection with Liam was her sister, Vanessa Hargrave, the bedrock of her world. Vanessa had given up her teenage years to raise Melody after their mother left and their father's depression worsened. Now a single mother herself, working double shifts as a trauma nurse, Vanessa was fiercely protective of Melody. Her son, Jaden, was 9, bright, clever, and painfully observant. He immediately took a liking to Liam, though Vanessa remained skeptical. She'd seen men like him, charismatic, polished, dangerously smooth. Just don't lose yourself trying to love someone who doesn't know how to be loved, she once warned Melody while folding laundry at midnight. Vanessa's world revolved around service and sacrifice. She didn't understand Liam's world of digital disruption and tech jargon, nor did she trust his intentions. Meanwhile, Liam began sharing more about his own family. His father, Gerald Callahan, had recently retired and was showing early signs of memory loss, though he denied it fiercely. Gerald was a man of few words and rigid expectations. When Melody finally met him, she noticed his silence wasn't just stern, it was haunted. Liam's need to succeed stemmed from this unspoken war between love and approval, between admiration and fear. The deeper Melody and Liam's friendship grew, the more she saw how much of Liam's strength was armor, not authenticity. It was during one of their early winter trips, visiting a cabin in Oregon, that the emotional terrain between them shifted. Melody had been invited to speak at a youth trauma symposium nearby, and Liam offered to drive her up and attend. The journey was filled with laughter, heated debates about philosophy versus practicality, and long silences that felt comforting rather than awkward. One night, after her presentation, Melody stepped outside into the falling snow, her cheeks flushed with pride and nerves. Liam followed. They stood under the porch light, the snow melting softly into their hair. "You make people feel seen," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. Melody turned to him, unsure of what to say, her heart thudding in rhythms she hadn't felt in years. "And you hide in plain sight," she replied. Their eyes held for a long moment, and something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the inevitable. But they didn't kiss. Not yet. Instead, they stood side by side, watching the snow fall, neither of them willing to rush what felt too rare to risk. It was the most intimate moment they'd ever shared, and perhaps the first time Liam realized that real connection had nothing to do with conquering someone's attention, and everything to do with earning their trust. 3 years passed between Melody and Liam like the gentle unfolding of a symphony, slow crescendos, quiet refrains, and the occasional offbeat chord. In those 3 years, their friendship had slowly grown into love, though neither of them had marked the exact moment when that transition occurred. It wasn't fireworks or loud declarations that defined their bond, it was the quiet moments, when Melody stayed up till 2 a.m. editing Liam's pitch decks, or when Liam sat at the back of community halls listening to her give mental health lectures to underprivileged youth. They were each other's mirror and compass, helping the other see where they'd been and where they were going. Melody had opened a modest therapy studio in Seattle, nothing grand, but something meaningful. Liam's startup, KlSSED, had just landed a major funding round from a Swiss angel investor. They took a vacation to celebrate, an impromptu getaway to Switzerland that Liam pitched as a break from the chaos. But he had something far more calculated in mind. Melody didn't know that hidden inside his laptop bag, wrapped inside a leather journal, was a ring he'd spent 3 months designing, an emerald-cut sapphire surrounded by a vine of diamonds, each representing a year they'd known one another. Liam had always been smooth, confident, and articulate. But as the time neared, even he found himself rehearsing his proposal in the mirror of their chalet bathroom. The proposal didn't happen at a restaurant or beneath fireworks, as Melody might have feared. Instead, it took place on a remote mountain trail overlooking Lake Lucerne, during a quiet night hike under the stars. Liam had arranged for a hidden string quartet to play softly from a distance, classical, gentle, hauntingly beautiful. They paused at a clearing, where lanterns flickered in a semicircle and pine cones lined the path. Melody was confused at first, her eyes wide with suspicion and wonder. And then Liam turned to her, holding a velvet box in his shaking hand. "You've seen parts of me no one else ever bothered to notice. You challenge me, soften me, and make me want to be better without ever asking for it. You don't just love me, Melody, you understand me. And I've never felt more seen." Her breath hitched. Her eyes brimmed with tears before he even knelt down. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. There was no dramatic pause, no hesitation. "Yes," she whispered. And in that moment, with the night air wrapping around them like silk, everything felt possible. Everything felt real. It was the kind of memory built not for photos or crowds, but for hearts that remember in silence. But soon after the glow of their engagement began to fade into daily life, cracks started to form, small ones, but sharp enough to draw blood. Melody, who had once been patient and measured with her anxiety, began feeling the pressure of perfection from all sides. Wedding planning unearthed her deepest insecurities about abandonment, worthiness, and control. She wanted to please everyone, especially Liam, but found herself suffocating under the weight of endless details, social obligations, and judgments from Liam's wealthy friends in Boston, who found her well-meaning but underwhelming. Vanessa noticed the shift instantly and urged her to take a break. But Melody pressed on, believing love required endurance. Meanwhile, Liam, though still loving, began pulling away during planning meetings. He often missed appointments with vague excuses, claimed he was handling investor meetings, and began treating the wedding like a corporate acquisition, efficient, impersonal, and goal-oriented. It was during this time that Noelle Stanford entered the picture. Bright, quick-witted, and ruthlessly strategic, she had just joined KlSSED as Liam's new executive assistant. Noelle was striking, a blonde with sharp cheekbones, eyes that never blinked too long, and an intelligence that masked her cunning. What no one knew yet was that Noelle didn't come to KlSSED to assist. She came to conquer, and her target had just slipped a sapphire ring on a therapist's hand. The first few months after the engagement were filled with a strange and uneven blend of joy and confusion. Melody was deep into designing the blueprint for what would be her life's purpose, the Haven Project, a sanctuary for trauma-affected youth. She imagined a place where broken voices could be heard, where children who carried pain like second skin could find safety and healing. It wasn't just an idea, it was her calling. She poured every waking moment into grant applications, community partnership proposals, and therapeutic model research. Meanwhile, Liam was in the heat of scaling KlSSED to prepare for a national rollout. Investors were pressing, deadlines were shrinking, and Liam's calendar was stuffed to the seams with pitch competitions and late-night video calls. Melody and Liam were still living in the same apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, but the silence between them grew thicker with every sunrise. Their priorities were shifting like tectonic plates beneath them, his toward expansion, hers toward restoration. They didn't argue yet, but there was an unspoken tension, like two people rowing different boats in opposite directions while pretending they were still side by side. It was during one of Melody's outreach trips to an inner-city school in Tacoma that she met Andrew Cormick, a soft-spoken, bespectacled graphic novelist who volunteered once a week to help children illustrate their pain through comics. His work was remarkable, dark, honest, yet deeply healing. The kids adored him, and so did the social workers. Andrew was quiet but observant, the kind of man who noticed when someone's smile didn't match their eyes. Melody, exhausted from another night of Liam not answering her texts, found herself opening up to Andrew over coffee after a Saturday workshop. Their conversation didn't drift toward romance, it lingered in the realm of shared empathy. Andrew had lost his brother to suicide years ago and had turned his grief into a career of creating therapeutic art. There was something grounding about him, no ego, no performance. Just honesty. He offered to design visual elements for the Haven Project, and Melody accepted without hesitation. She never mentioned Liam. And Andrew never asked. But as they parted ways that evening, he looked at her and said, "Whatever you're building, it's going to save lives. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." That single sentence echoed in her chest longer than Liam's "I'm proud of you" ever had. Liam, meanwhile, had been traveling more frequently, with Noelle. He justified it as strategy sessions and investor briefings, but even his closest colleague, Alec Byrne, a senior systems architect at KlSSED, noticed the sudden closeness between Liam and his assistant. Noelle played her role perfectly, professional, indispensable, and always available. She would stand just close enough to whisper but far enough to avoid suspicion. But beneath her polished surface was a woman driven by a hunger for status, power, and validation. She admired Liam's ambition, envied his influence, and despised the softness that Melody represented. To Noelle, love was a game of leverage, not emotion. She began seeding doubts, subtle comments like "You seem distracted lately," or "Are you sure Melody's not holding you back from the bigger picture?" Liam didn't bite at first. But the more overwhelmed he became, the more appealing Noelle's simplicity felt. She didn't need him to explain emotional nuance, didn't challenge him with childhood trauma conversations, didn't ask about his father. She made him feel competent again. That allure was dangerous. Liam and Melody were still engaged, still publicly in love. But behind the scenes, their dreams weren't merging, they were colliding. And in that silent collision, the first fractures of something sacred began to form. Neither of them knew yet, but the foundation was already cracking. The wedding was exquisite, but curiously hollow. Held in a restored vineyard estate in Napa Valley, with soft jazz playing under twilight skies, candlelight on every table, and handwritten vows exchanged before tearful guests, it had all the makings of a fairy tale. But even fairy tales crack at the spine. Melody had wanted something simple, intimate, surrounded by children from her practice and her sister's laughter. Liam wanted spectacle. Corporate friends, investors, sleek photographers, and influential guests lined the aisle as much for networking as for love. She smiled through it, for the cameras, for Vanessa, for her patients who watched the live stream with hopeful eyes. But that night, as the world toasted to their union with champagne, Melody stood by the balcony in her silk wedding robe, looking out at the horizon while Liam reviewed a last-minute investor presentation. "Just 5 minutes," he'd said. But the 5 turned to 40, then sleep. The next morning, they were on different sides of the bed, both physically and metaphorically. It was an omen of the months to follow. They were no longer just lovers or partners, they were cohabitants of a beautiful apartment with shared calendars and a widening silence. Liam's rise in the tech industry began accelerating. KlSSED was named among the top 10 AI solution providers to watch by Forbes, and invitations poured in: conferences, innovation summits, television interviews. His charm and composure in front of the camera made him a media darling. At home, however, his charm began to wear thin. He became a phantom presence, leaving before sunrise, returning after midnight. His excuses were always justified. "You want this company to succeed, don't you? I'm doing this for us." But us became an abstract promise, a placeholder for a partnership that no longer breathed. Melody noticed how Liam stopped asking about the Haven project. He'd forgotten the color palette she had chosen for the therapy rooms, couldn't remember the names of the young volunteers she'd spoken so passionately about. And when she asked if they could schedule a weekend away to reconnect, he replied without looking up, "Babe, just talk to Noelle. She manages my calendar now." Melody laughed at first, thinking it was sarcasm. But the empty expression in Liam's eyes made her stomach churn. That night, as she washed dishes alone in their marble-trimmed kitchen, she whispered to herself, "He's here, but he's already gone." Vanessa was the first to voice what Melody hadn't yet admitted aloud. During one of their weekly brunches, as Jaden played with Legos beside them, Vanessa leaned in and asked, "When's the last time you two actually talked, like, not about projects or appearances, but about life?" Melody sipped her orange juice in silence. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "He's changing," she said plainly. "You're shrinking." At first, Melody defended him, as she always did. "He's stressed. The tech space is brutal. It's just a season." But that night, she found herself scrolling through his Instagram feed, not as a wife admiring her husband, but as an outsider observing a stranger. Noelle was in every other photo, standing beside him at panels, laughing in team selfies, seated beside him in cafes tagged with #brainstorming. Melody brought it up once. Liam waved it off. "She's efficient. I need her." "You of all people should know how important mental support is." That stung. She stopped asking questions after that. Instead, she resumed journaling, something she hadn't done since college. In those pages, she chronicled the beginning of a quiet unraveling. It wasn't the dramatic kind, the screaming, crying, glass-shattering kind. It was the subtle unraveling, the kind that happens when one partner goes to sleep feeling alone, and the other wakes up forgetting who's beside them. The invitation came as a surprise, an all-expenses-paid tech executive retreat hosted by Solaris Group on a private island in the Bahamas. Melody was shocked when Liam asked her to come along. After months of feeling invisible, this felt like a gesture of hope, a spark amid the growing void. "We need this," Liam had said with a half-smile, handing her the itinerary as though it were a truce. Melody wanted to believe him. She convinced herself that this would be their reset, a chance to remember what they once were. The island itself was breathtaking: white sands, sprawling villas, and moonlit beaches carved into untouched beauty. But from the moment they landed, Melody realized Liam hadn't brought her to reconnect, he'd brought her to maintain appearances. She was introduced not as his wife, but as the therapist from Seattle, very passionate about youth development, as though her title were irrelevant in this new world of innovation moguls and VC sharks. At the welcome dinner, she sat 2 seats away while Liam laughed with Jordan Voss, his brash business partner known for misogynistic jokes and a Rolex obsession. Jordan called her the sweet one, then winked at Noelle, who was seated beside Liam, dressed in a red backless gown Melody could never have imagined herself in. Noelle didn't say much, but the glances between her and Liam spoke volumes. The days blurred into yacht parties, poolside panels, and curated fireside chats about market disruption. Melody tried to join, to engage, to remind Liam she still existed beside him. But every time she opened her mouth, she felt like she was interrupting something unspoken. Liam became colder, more dismissive, as though her presence embarrassed him. "Try to be less intense," he whispered once before dinner. "These people don't want to talk about trauma therapy." Melody forced a smile and bit her tongue. On the third evening, after a day spent mostly alone while Liam took Noelle on a jet ski to discuss mobile integration, Melody attempted to salvage the night. She wore a dress Liam once said he loved, styled her curls, and joined him for dinner. But halfway through the meal, while Melody tried to discuss expanding the Haven project to underserved neighborhoods, Jordan loudly declared, "Why don't you just open a crying cafe or something?" Laughter erupted at the table. Liam didn't defend her. He didn't even look at her. Melody stood up, her eyes misted, and walked off into the night, her heels sinking into the sand behind her. She walked the shoreline for hours, tears falling without sound. The island was paradise, but Melody had never felt more lost. Later that night, Liam found her sitting on a bench by the water, her feet bare, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The stars were scattered across the sky like broken glass. "You embarrassed me," he said, standing behind her. That dinner was not the place for a therapy pitch. Melody turned slowly, her face calm but hollow. "I didn't know sharing my life's work was embarrassing." Liam sighed and sat beside her, staring out at the dark waves. "This world moves fast, Mel. You get one chance to make an impression. No one cares about emotional baggage here." The word stung more than any insult could have. For the first time, Melody didn't argue. She just nodded and looked away. That night, they returned to the villa in silence. Liam slept facing the wall. Melody curled into herself, listening to the crashing waves outside as her heart broke quietly within. In her journal that night, she didn't write about the island or the humiliation. She wrote one line: "He no longer sees me. And maybe he doesn't want to." The retreat ended with smiling photos and polite goodbyes. But something inside Melody had shifted. What was once hope had now hardened into awakening. And it was only the beginning of what would unravel next. Noelle Stanford knew how to disarm people before they even realized they'd surrendered. Her beauty was sharp, her intelligence disarming, and her ambition ruthless. But behind her polished exterior and designer pencil skirts was a girl who grew up in the shadows of broken promises. Raised in Nevada by a mother who believed femininity was currency and relationships were battlegrounds, Noelle had learned early that softness equaled vulnerability, and vulnerability meant being left behind. Her mother, Lucinda, had been a cocktail waitress who passed off seduction as survival, cycling through abusive men like seasons. Noelle watched her mother cry over love one day and teach her how to fake an orgasm the next. There were no lullabies in her childhood, only lessons on leverage. She promised herself that one day, she wouldn't be the woman begging to be chosen. She'd be the one doing the choosing. Her path to Liam Callahan wasn't accidental. She had followed his career for a year before even applying to Calitech, impressing his board with a fake portfolio, exaggerated credentials, and a glowing recommendation from a man she'd once seduced and blackmailed. Noelle didn't want Liam's heart, she wanted his power. And the only thing standing between her and the throne was Melody, the therapist wife with soft eyes and gentle ideals. In Noelle's world, kindness was weakness. And weakness was to be eradicated. Back in Seattle, Melody tried to salvage what remained of her marriage by burying herself in her work. She doubled her hours at her studio, hosted trauma workshops in underfunded schools, and threw herself into fundraising for the Haven Project. But even in her sanctuary, Liam's absence echoed. She'd see couples holding hands in therapy groups and wonder when she stopped being touched. She no longer waited up for him. Instead, she cooked for one, ate by the window, and wrote poetry she never intended to share. Vanessa, ever the fierce protector, noticed the shift immediately. One evening, after helping Melody prepare for a mental health gala, Vanessa placed her hands on her sister's shoulders and said, "If he's making you feel like you're invisible, maybe it's time to ask why you're still staying visible in his life." Melody couldn't answer. She just adjusted her necklace and whispered, "I still love him." Vanessa didn't respond, but her silence screamed. At the gala, Liam arrived 2 hours late, wearing the wrong tie and with Noelle on his arm, dressed in silver like she owned the room. "She's my assistant," Liam explained quickly. No one else could prep the numbers. But Melody noticed the smirk on Noelle's lips. The way she touched Liam's arm. And how every woman in the room turned to stare, not with admiration, but with silent judgment. That night, Melody didn't cry. She watched. She listened. And something inside her, a voice long buried, began to stir. Weeks later, Vanessa could no longer hold her peace. At a charity fundraiser hosted by one of Seattle's mental health foundations, she cornered Liam near the wine bar. She was calm, poised, but every word she spoke carried heat. "You're walking around like the man of the year," she said, "but you've become a stranger to the only person who ever believed in you without needing a pitch deck." Liam scoffed, glancing around nervously. "This isn't the place, Vanessa." But Vanessa leaned closer, her voice low and sharp. "And you think humiliating my sister in front of donors and influencers is okay? You think everyone can't see what you're doing with that snake beside you?" Liam's jaw clenched. "Noelle is just part of my team," he said, but the lie crumbled in his throat. Vanessa didn't need to shout, her gaze was enough to cut through the facade. "Keep treating her like she's disposable, Liam. One day, you'll wake up, and she'll be gone. And all this power you think you've built? It'll bury you." She walked away without waiting for a response. Liam returned to Noelle's side, suddenly uneasy. That night, Melody read a note from a child at her center, "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." She folded it carefully and placed it inside her journal. For the first time, she didn't write about Liam. She wrote about herself. And for the first time in a long time, she signed it, "With love, Melody." The shadow was still looming, but Melody was beginning to remember her own light. The first whisper of trouble came in the form of a cryptic email sent anonymously to the KlSSED board. It read, "Data breach covered. Check the code log, November 4th, for 12 a.m. someone's erasing the truth." Liam dismissed it as spam, a jealous competitor's trick to rattle them ahead of their upcoming funding round. But over the following weeks, more signs emerged: errors in the AI engine's reporting dashboard, customer complaints about privacy breaches, and investors asking questions Liam had no real answers for. Noelle, ever composed, advised him to pin the blame on the junior developers and reroute attention to their upcoming product launch. "We don't need bad press," she whispered during a meeting, brushing invisible lint off his sleeve like a wife, not a subordinate. "Just handle the messaging. Let me take care of the rest." And Liam did. He trusted her. But he failed to notice the growing unease within his team. Alec Byrne, the system architect who had been with KlSSED from the garage days, started keeping his own records, private, encrypted, and stored off-site. Alec didn't trust Noelle. And more importantly, he was beginning to doubt Liam. What once felt like a visionary mission now looked like an empire built on distraction, ego, and the silencing of internal voices. The company's culture, once collaborative, had become cutthroat, and the man who once inspired loyalty now ruled through fear masked as ambition. While Liam scrambled to maintain his public image, Melody continued to breathe life into the Haven Project. With every child she counseled, every mother she guided through trauma-informed parenting, she felt her purpose deepen. One rainy afternoon, she stopped by a small independent bookstore in Capitol Hill to speak at a mental health panel. She arrived early, nervously adjusting her notes, when a man browsing the social justice section accidentally knocked over a stack of books. As Melody helped him pick them up, they exchanged polite laughs and casual introductions. His name was Marcus Wade, a freelance investigative journalist and podcaster known for exposing unethical tech practices. He looked disheveled but intelligent, scruffy beard, coffee-stained notebook, and eyes that studied everything twice. Unbeknownst to Melody, Marcus had been gathering intel on KlSSED's irregularities for months, and the trail had begun to lead toward Liam and his mysterious assistant. What Marcus didn't expect was to run into Liam's wife, nor did he realize how much insight Melody unknowingly held. She recommended a book on ethical corporate culture without realizing the irony, and when they parted ways, Marcus made a mental note: she doesn't know what he's doing. Yet. He slipped a recording device back into his coat and headed to his car, eyes sharper than before. The pieces were coming together, and the center of the puzzle was about to be revealed. Meanwhile, Liam was at a rooftop cocktail event in San Francisco, shaking hands with potential partners, unaware that the walls around his empire were thinning. That night, he gave a brief speech about integrity, innovation, and disruption, his voice smooth, his smile calculated. Noelle stood beside him, shimmering in black satin, her hand lingering on his back a second too long. The press caught it. One photograph, in particular, began to circulate, a candid shot of Liam with his hand resting on Noelle's lower back, her face turned toward him in mid-laugh. A popular tech gossip blog published it under the headline, "Wife at Home, Mistress at the Mic." At first, Liam brushed it off, but the comments were brutal. Melody saw the photo when it appeared in her email inbox, an anonymous sender, no message. She stared at it for a long time. Not in shock. Not even in pain. But in clarity. She closed the laptop, stood up from her desk at the therapy center, and looked out the window. The rain had stopped. The sky was beginning to clear. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't tremble. For the first time, she realized that the storm was no longer outside, it had passed through her, and she had survived. The worst wasn't what Liam had done. It was the version of herself she had let wither trying to keep his name polished. But now she was starting to reclaim the parts of her she hadn't even realized were missing. Liam agreed to attend therapy not because he believed in it, but because his PR manager insisted it would help clean up the growing public perception that he was emotionally negligent. He hated the waiting room, the soft piano music, the scent of lavender, the magazines with headlines like "Healing is a Journey." He scoffed at the notion that talking could fix anything. Still, he showed up, arms folded, jaw clenched, his eyes flicking from clock to door every 3 minutes. The therapist, Dr. Meredith Shaw, a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair and velvet-like patience, didn't push him. She asked simple questions. How do you handle disappointment? Who comforted you when you failed as a child? At first, Liam dodged every question with sarcasm or business metaphors. But Dr. Shaw wasn't new to emotional walls. She knew how to sit in silence until the silence became more uncomfortable than the truth. On his third visit, he admitted, grudgingly, that he often felt like Melody saw through him in ways that scared the hell out of him. He called her too intense. Too soft. She wants to fix everything, he said. Even the parts of me that I'm fine with being broken. Dr. Shaw didn't argue. She simply nodded and asked, "And what do you think scares you more, being broken or being seen?" Liam didn't answer. He stared at the floor for the rest of the session. Back at home, Melody found herself sinking deeper into emotional exhaustion. Her studio was thriving, children left her notes of gratitude, and therapists from around the state were requesting workshops. But the success did little to ease the ache in her chest each time Liam walked past her without a glance, or the coldness of his voice when he asked, "You're still on about that kid center thing?" She stopped trying to initiate conversations. Stopped making his coffee. Stopped waiting up for him at night. Vanessa urged her to consider separation, but Melody wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, she started seeing Dr. Karina Rojas, a retired trauma psychologist she'd long admired. Their sessions were private and intense, focused not on fixing the marriage, but on fixing the damage Melody had absorbed trying to hold it together. "You're allowed to feel angry," Karina told her one afternoon. "Anger is not aggression, it's awareness. And you've been aware of his absence for longer than you've admitted." Melody wept that day. Not out of heartbreak, but from the recognition that she had betrayed herself by clinging to a version of Liam that no longer existed. She journaled that night, "He is the sculpture. I am the stone that was chipped away to make him appear whole. She looked at the blank page beneath that line and realized for the first time she had more to write about herself, not him. Their 6th wedding anniversary arrived like a cruel joke, quiet, unspoken, ignored. Melody had arranged dinner reservations at a waterfront restaurant they once visited during their engagement year, even wore the navy dress Liam used to say made her look like a star. But Liam never showed. He didn't text. Didn't call. Instead, he attended a KlSSED networking mixer, Noelle by his side, arm in arm. Pictures surfaced online within the hour. Melody sat at the table alone, staring at the melting candle, her untouched food, and the couples around her exchanging laughs and stolen kisses. She asked the waiter to pack the food to go. On the drive home, she passed the empty schoolyard where she once volunteered on weekends, and she pulled over. Got out. Sat on the swings alone in the dark, the metal chains creaking beneath her. She didn't cry. She just sat there, her hands gripping cold metal, the night air biting at her skin. Liam came home after midnight, reeking of cologne and bourbon, his tie loose, his shirt untucked. Melody was in bed, awake but motionless. He paused in the doorway, then muttered, "Let's not do this now. I'm tired." She stared at the ceiling, her throat burning. "So am I," she whispered. But he didn't hear her. Or maybe, deep down, he no longer cared to. The announcement came via an embossed invitation sealed with the emblem of the National Innovation Bureau. Liam Callahan had been nominated for the prestigious Innovation CEO of the Year award. It was a recognition that could open international doors for KlSSED, attract global investors, and place him on the covers of business magazines across the world. When Melody found the invitation on the kitchen counter, she felt something strange, pride laced with sadness. She congratulated him with a warm but weary smile, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that the spotlight would awaken in Liam the man she'd once known. "I'd love to help you prepare your speech," she offered one evening, placing a leather notebook in front of him. Liam nodded, distracted, eyes glued to his phone. "Sure. Just keep it polished. Nothing too heavy." Melody spent the next 2 nights pouring herself into the speech, writing words that balanced humility and brilliance, sincerity and strength. It was eloquent, powerful, and authentic. But when she handed it to him, Liam barely skimmed it before shoving it into his briefcase with a grunt. "Thanks, Mel." "Got it." She waited for a thank you that never came. Noelle, on the other hand, had taken over the logistics, outfit coordination, media briefings, red carpet details. She ordered a custom midnight blue tuxedo for Liam and personally scheduled pre-interviews. Melody noticed how Noelle now had access to things she herself had once managed. And though her heart ached, she convinced herself this was just a professional phase. But in her bones, she knew something was shifting. Something irreversible. The night before the award ceremony, Melody ironed Liam's tuxedo shirt and laid it neatly on the bed beside a silver tie she bought months ago, still in its box. She left him a handwritten note, "You've earned this. Be bold. Be grateful. Be kind." She even arranged for a private driver, wanting everything to feel seamless. When she asked if she should arrive early to sit beside him, Liam responded without looking up from his laptop, "I think you should just meet me there. Might be easier with press and seating charts." He offered a peck on the cheek, detached, mechanical. Melody forced a nod, her throat tightening. She had already picked out a gown for the event, a soft gold dress that shimmered under the light, chosen not to impress, but to reclaim some piece of herself. Vanessa, sensing the rising tide beneath her sister's calm, offered to go with her. "If he tries anything at all, you'll have backup," she said fiercely, zipping up Melody's dress with trembling hands. Melody chuckled, but the sound was hollow. That night, she stayed up journaling. Something about the way Liam had been behaving stirred an invisible dread in her chest. She remembered the look Noelle gave her last week, a look not of competition, but of conquest. And though Melody couldn't name it yet, her soul recognized betrayal before her eyes ever would. On the day of the event, the venue was abuzz with flashing lights, reporters swarming, and CEOs arriving in sleek black cars. Liam stood tall, surrounded by his board, a perfect picture of calculated charisma. Melody arrived separately, stepping out of the car alone, camera flashes catching the glint of her gown. A few reporters called her name, but most had their lenses aimed at Liam, and at Noelle, who hovered close, her crimson gown hugging her like armor. "Isn't that his assistant?" someone whispered nearby. Melody kept walking, her heels clicking against the marble floor of the auditorium, the walls closing in around her like a slow inhale of tension. She finally reached her reserved seat in the second row, surprised to find her nameplate missing. A confused usher directed her 3 rows back. "There must have been a last-minute change," he murmured. She sat quietly, smile frozen, heart pounding. From the corner of her eye, she saw Noelle whisper something to Liam before the opening speech. He nodded slowly, eyes scanning the crowd. And then, for the first time that night, his gaze met Melody's. It lingered, but it didn't soften. It pierced. Melody's fingers gripped the armrest. The lights dimmed. The host took the stage. And in that moment, she didn't know whether she was about to watch her husband rise to glory, or watch him burn everything to the ground with a single, irreversible choice. The auditorium glowed beneath soft white stage lights as the MC praised KlSSED's innovation, announcing Liam Callahan as the night's final and most celebrated honoree. A standing ovation erupted as Liam walked confidently toward the podium, his tux perfectly pressed, his grin flawless. Cameras from all major networks zoomed in. The audience, made up of industry leaders, investors, reporters, and political dignitaries, applauded louder when Noelle stood as well, adjusting her dress and clapping like a proud wife. Melody clapped too, slowly, quietly, her heart heavy but hopeful. She had no idea the storm was just seconds away. As Liam approached the mic, he took a deep breath, pretending to scan his speech notes. But instead of reading, he turned to Noelle and beckoned her forward. A murmur rippled through the room. Noelle, radiant in red, made her way to the stage with a confident stride, her smile sweetly sinister. Without a word, Liam leaned in and kissed her, full on the lips. Flashbulbs exploded. Gasps rang out. The host dropped his cue card. For 3 seconds, the world froze. Then chaos followed. The audience erupted into whispers, some stunned, others chuckling in disbelief. Reporters snapped hundreds of photos in rapid-fire succession. Melody's hands dropped from her lap. Her mouth opened, but no words came. All she could hear was the deafening rush of blood in her ears. Liam turned back to the microphone with a smug grin, pretending as though nothing shocking had just occurred. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "they say behind every successful man is a woman. Or, in some cases, a woman who thinks she's a licensed psychologist because she listens well." A few forced chuckles emerged from the crowd, unsure if it was satire. But Liam wasn't done. "I want to thank the real backbone of my company, Noelle Stanford. A woman who's not only competent and intelligent but stable, sane, and real." He emphasized the word sane with a smirk. "I've had to endure a lot this year, especially from people who confuse delusion with devotion. But I'm done pretending. I'm done babysitting emotional instability. Tonight, I stand with truth." That's when it became clear, this wasn't a spontaneous moment. It was a calculated demolition. Melody blinked rapidly, struggling to process that the man she once called home had publicly discarded her with the kind of ease people use to throw away worn-out shoes. She looked around. No one met her eyes. Not even Liam. Not even Noelle. Her fingers trembled. Her throat locked. She stood up and quietly exited the room, the applause still echoing behind her like bullets against her spine. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp, the kind that slapped your skin into alertness. Melody stumbled down the front steps of the venue, heels unsteady, heart in pieces. A paparazzi camera flashed in her face, and she instinctively raised her hand, shielding her eyes. One reporter yelled, "Mrs. Callahan, did you know about the affair?" Another asked, "Is it true you've been institutionalized?" She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her vision blurred as she pushed past them into the black car Vanessa had waiting. Vanessa, having seen the broadcast on a monitor inside, opened the door with fire in her eyes and grief in her chest. Melody collapsed into her arms. No words were spoken during the ride home. Vanessa just held her, whispering over and over again, "You didn't deserve that." At home, Melody sat silently on the floor of her living room, still in her gold dress, staring at the flickering shadows on the wall. Her phone buzzed nonstop, friends, family, the press. She turned it off and crawled into bed. But sleep didn't come. Only memories. Only echoes. Only a single haunting realization: Liam hadn't just humiliated her, he had erased her. And in that moment, under the weight of betrayal, Melody Hargrave made herself a vow, not revenge, not hatred, but a vow that this would not be the end of her story. No. This would be the beginning of something entirely new. By sunrise, the internet had erupted. The video clip of Liam kissing Noelle and publicly mocking Melody had gone viral. News outlets plastered the footage across every social platform, dissecting his words, her silence, and the sharp contrast between the assistant's smug grin and the wife's haunting absence. #CallahanClown trended within hours. But even more viral was the hashtag Stand With Melody, sparked by a short clip of her walking out of the venue alone, her gold gown glittering like dignity forged in fire. Thousands reposted the clip, adding captions like "Grace in the face of betrayal," and "She left the room." But she didn't lose the fight. Public opinion divided swiftly. Tech insiders rallied around Liam, claiming he was brave enough to leave a toxic, unstable relationship. But therapists, women's advocacy groups, celebrities, and even former clients of Melody's stood up with fury. Screenshots from the past began resurfacing, tweets Noelle had liked mocking mental health, photos of her too close presence beside Liam long before any public admission. Even still images of Melody at charity events began to trend, her reading to disabled children, holding hands with trauma victims, smiling behind tears. She was no longer just the wife. She became a symbol of composure, of strength, of every woman who had ever been silenced and shamed for daring to feel too deeply. At Vanessa's apartment, Melody sat curled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, hair undone, the TV on mute but flashing images of her face from every network. Jaden sat quietly beside her, holding her hand, unsure why the world was so interested in his aunt, but knowing enough to say, "You're still the best person I know." Melody hadn't slept. She had barely eaten. But her mind was no longer fogged with confusion, it was flooded with clarity. She saw Liam for who he truly was now, a man not threatened by her instability, but by her brilliance. Vanessa paced the living room like a lioness. "You don't owe anyone silence anymore," she said, tapping her phone. "You have a voice. Use it." Melody hesitated. "It's not about revenge," she said. "Then make it about truth," Vanessa snapped. "Because he didn't just lie about you, he told the world a story you didn't write." That afternoon, Melody finally opened her laptop. The Haven Project inbox was overflowing, messages from clients, therapists, media agencies, and women she had never met. One stood out: "I watched what he did to you. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't crazy. I was just unheard." Melody inhaled deeply, cracked her knuckles, and typed a reply. The first line: "Thank you for seeing me." Across town, Liam sat in a high-rise boardroom, completely unaware that his public favor had begun to rot beneath the surface. Caltech's largest investor, Thorne and Wayland Capital, had issued a private inquiry requesting internal ethics reports and PR damage assessment. Several smaller sponsors pulled out within 24 hours, citing alignment concerns. Noelle, despite her smug exterior, was visibly shaken, constantly refreshing news feeds, offering half-hearted spin responses to media backlash, and trying to reassure Liam with promises of bounce-backs. "This is temporary," she whispered, gripping his shoulder. "People forget fast." But Liam knew better. His inbox was filled with meeting cancellations. His father, Gerald, left a chilling voicemail that simply said, "You've lost more than you realize." And Alec Byrne, his most trusted engineer, hadn't shown up to work since the broadcast. Liam blamed Melody for the fallout. He didn't think she'd stay silent forever, but he underestimated her reach, her story, her quiet army of survivors. That night, Melody sat alone at her sister's kitchen table, flipping through an old scrapbook from her first year in practice. She lingered on a picture of her standing beside her first patient, a foster girl named Gemma who once said, "You saved me from disappearing." Melody smiled faintly. She whispered to the empty kitchen, "I'm not disappearing either." The world had responded. And now, it was her turn. Melody didn't return to her therapy studio for a full week after the public scandal, but when she did, the room felt different, charged, sacred, alive. The soft light through the windows, the aroma of sandalwood and lavender, the hand-painted quotes on the walls, it was all hers. No cameras followed her through the doors. No PR speeches or staged comebacks. Just children waiting in the lobby and mothers silently grateful that someone still believed in empathy over headlines. But something within Melody had changed. She was no longer just a therapist or a woman recovering from public betrayal, she was becoming a voice. That same week, she received an invitation from Dr. Karina Rojas, an internationally recognized trauma psychologist and author. Karina had seen the viral clip, read the tweets, and listened to Melody's quiet online statement. She reached out with a proposition: co-host a podcast called Unbroken Lines, a space for survivors of emotional abuse, gaslighting, and public shaming. Melody hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready to be a public voice when she was still healing herself. But Karina's voice over the phone was gentle and certain. Your silence kept him powerful. Your voice will make others powerful. The first episode launched within 2 weeks. The title? When They Call You Crazy. The podcast exploded. Within days, Unbroken Lines hit trending charts across major streaming platforms. Women from every continent wrote in, teachers, nurses, CEOs, mothers, students, each one sharing stories of being dismissed as unstable or too emotional after surviving years of manipulation. Melody shared parts of her journey without bitterness, and Karina's clinical experience gave structure to the pain. Together, they created a healing space that was raw, unscripted, and life-changing. Melody's words, once kept inside journal pages, now became lifelines. She spoke about how betrayal often hides behind charisma, how abusers wear suits, and how victims don't always have bruises. Her honesty was magnetic. She cried on air once, reading a letter from a listener who said, "Because of you, I finally left him. I finally chose me." Within a month, media houses came calling, offers for TV interviews, book deals, and speaking engagements. She declined most. This wasn't about fame, it was about freedom. Vanessa helped her set boundaries, and Jaden would sit with her during editing, proud and curious. For the first time in months, Melody slept through the night. Not because the world was quiet, but because her voice was finally louder than the silence. Liam, meanwhile, watched her rise from afar, disbelief twisting in his gut. He hadn't expected Melody to fight back, at least not like this. He thought she'd retreat into shame, maybe start over quietly in some corner of Seattle. But instead, she was on magazine covers, not for scandal, but for strength. Forbes Women featured her as the voice of the voiceless, and TEDx invited her to headline a special event on psychological resilience. KlSSED's board, already shaken by the social media blowback and investor withdrawals, was beginning to question Liam's leadership altogether. Noel, feeling the walls close in, grew increasingly defensive, lashing out at staff, spinning conspiracies that Melody had planted everything. But no one was listening anymore. The world had found a new favorite. And Liam, once a symbol of innovation, had become a cautionary tale of ego, cruelty, and collapse. At his next public appearance, fewer reporters showed up. One even asked bluntly, "Any comment on your ex-wife's podcast?" Liam smiled tightly, eyes narrowing. "No. I don't entertain fiction." But deep down, he knew this wasn't fiction. It was fire. And Melody wasn't done. She was rising from the ashes he left her in, and this time, she wasn't coming back for him, she was coming back for every woman who had ever been told she was too much, too emotional, too broken. And she was doing it with power, grace, and a voice no one would ever silence again. The first formal inquiry came wrapped in a legal envelope bearing the logo of Thorne and Wayland Capital, the investment firm that had once proudly funneled millions into KlSSED. Inside was a single-page letter requesting access to all internal financial records, data security reports, and employee grievance files dating back 2 years. Liam skimmed the letter twice, his chest tightening as he tried to piece together where the leak had sprung from. Noelle insisted it was nothing, routine due diligence, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. Liam dismissed the red flags until 2 more firms followed suit, each with their own questions about unethical terminations, missing audit logs, and inconsistencies in privacy compliance. Internally, unrest was brewing. Several developers anonymously submitted complaints about forged back-end codes and NDA violations. Alec Byrne, once Liam's most trusted architect, had gone completely off-grid, refusing to return messages or attend meetings. Unbeknownst to Liam, Alec had become a key informant for Marcus Wade's investigative report. Marcus had already compiled weeks of evidence, testimonies, timestamped backups, and even voice recordings of Noel and Liam discussing burying the November breach. What started as whispers was now becoming a thunderstorm. KlSSED's board of directors, sensing vulnerability, called for a closed-door emergency meeting. Liam arrived, sharp-suited and composed, but the air was tense, questions sharper than ever. Why was protocol bypassed during the November breach? Who authorized the internal log wipes? Why is our lead engineer unreachable? The CEO of one of their largest enterprise clients had just pulled their partnership over ethics concerns. Liam deflected, dodged, spun narratives about sabotage and misunderstanding. But the confidence that once seduced rooms now sounded defensive, brittle, almost desperate. One board member, a seasoned cybersecurity expert, asked coldly, "Is it true your assistant had unrestricted access to encryption keys?" Liam paused. "She had clearance. She's efficient." The room fell silent. That word, efficient, sounded less like praise now and more like a euphemism for recklessness. After the meeting, 2 board members resigned. An anonymous whistleblower leaked portions of Liam's internal memos to a tech watchdog site, and within hours, headlines read, "KlSSED CEO under fire, is innovation built on corruption?" The media frenzy reignited. But this time, Melody's name was no longer tied to the scandal. This was Liam's to bear alone. As panic grew inside the company, Liam's carefully manicured world began to implode. Noelle, feeling the ground shift beneath her designer heels, started protecting herself. She withdrew large sums from a shared crypto wallet, moved private files into hidden folders, and began calling in favors from ex-lovers, lawyers, and anyone who could provide cover. Liam, suspicious but too entangled, confronted her one late night in the office. "Are you preparing to run?" he asked, jaw tense. Noelle smiled without humor. "I'm preparing for survival." She walked out without another word. The next morning, KlSSED was hit with a formal subpoena. Employees began clearing their desks quietly. Vendors pulled contracts. Even Liam's personal assistant quit, leaving behind a resignation letter that read, "I didn't sign up to be part of a cover-up." Melody watched from afar, not with vengeance, but with an eerie calm. She was approached by Marcus Wade for an interview on record, but she declined. "He'll bury himself," she said softly. "All I had to do was step out of the way." And she was right. The same hands that built KlSSED were now the ones tearing it apart, brick by brick, lie by lie. And Liam? The man who once kissed his mistress on national television to humiliate his wife was now facing the kiss of justice, and it was far colder than anything he had imagined. The coastal town of Seabrook had always been a hidden gem, salt-kissed air, pastel-painted buildings, and a gentle hum of peace that wrapped around its residents like a lullaby. It was here that Melody found the perfect property for the Haven Project's permanent home. The space was a weathered brick building with ivy crawling along the sides, once a nursing home but now hollow and forgotten. Where others saw decay, Melody saw potential. With the help of a silent grant from a mental health alliance and growing public support from her podcast audience, she purchased the building outright. It became her canvas for rebirth. The walls were painted in soft blues and sage greens. Therapy rooms were lined with books, sensory tools, and soft lighting. Outside, a garden was planted by trauma survivors themselves, each flower bed named after those who contributed to the healing mission. Children began trickling in, some referred through schools, others through shelters, and every single one left a handprint mural on the back wall, forming a mosaic of silent strength. Melody wasn't just building a center, she was building legacy. One no man could ever erase. And while her name became synonymous with hope, her story never centered on her pain, it centered on her rise. As the Haven Project bloomed, so did the circle of people around her. Marcus Wade, the journalist who had once stumbled into her life at a bookstore, returned, not as an investigator, but as a friend. He offered to document the center's progress through a short docu-series called Haven, Where Healing Lives. At first, Melody was hesitant. She had just rebuilt her life away from the camera's harsh light. But Marcus pitched it differently. "This isn't your story, Mel. It's theirs. You're just the echo that helped them speak. Eventually, she agreed, and his quiet presence at the center never felt intrusive. He captured moments of magic, children dancing during art therapy, a mother reading to her daughter for the first time since surviving abuse, a teenage boy opening up about his self-harm scars without shame. Melody watched the rough cuts and wept, not for what she'd lost, but for the hundreds of lives she had unknowingly prepared to protect. And then, unexpectedly, Andrew Cormack re-entered her life, the graphic novelist with the soft voice and careful eyes she'd met back when the Haven was only a dream. He'd heard of her rise and reached out to volunteer. "I'd still love to draw healing," he wrote in his email. She replied with a simple, "Welcome home." Melody wasn't looking for love. She wasn't looking for closure either. She was simply looking for peace. But peace, it turned out, came wrapped in small gestures, Marcus bringing her herbal tea during editing sessions, Andrew designing a mural that read "You matter." Even when broken. The center's opening day was attended by over 300 people, including educators, therapists, survivors, and silent observers who had followed her journey from humiliation to honor. Vanessa stood beside her during the ribbon-cutting ceremony, tears shimmering in her eyes. Jaden wore a navy blue vest and gave a short speech. Auntie Melody makes people believe they still matter. Even when it hurts. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. Melody didn't cry, not then. She stood proudly in the sunlight, her heart full. Not of revenge. Not of validation. But of purpose. Her past wasn't erased, it had simply been reframed. She wasn't Liam's discarded wife. She was Melody Hargrave, the founder of something eternal. And in the audience, leaning quietly by the garden fence, Liam's father, Gerald Callahan, watched it all unfold with a cane in hand and regret in his eyes. He didn't approach. He simply tipped his hat and walked away. Because even he now knew, his son may have had the spotlight once, but Melody had the light. The trial began under the gray weight of a winter morning, the kind that threatened rain but held its breath long enough to remind you a storm was near. The courthouse in downtown Seattle was surrounded by media vans and protesters holding signs reading "Accountability Now" and "Justice for Whistleblowers." Inside, Liam sat at the defendant's table, clean-shaven and suited, but stripped of the charisma that once hypnotized boardrooms. Noelle Stanford, once his shadow and public partner, was nowhere to be found. She had disappeared days before her scheduled testimony, and rumors swirled about an escape route through Lisbon, a stolen identity, and a forged passport. Interpol had been notified. Liam's legal team was visibly tense, his defense strategy had hinged heavily on her cooperation. The charges against him included data manipulation, securities fraud, intellectual property theft, and obstruction of federal investigation. But underneath all the legal jargon was a deeper narrative. Liam had not only manipulated systems, he had manipulated people. The prosecutors painted a picture of a man so consumed by optics that he blurred the line between ambition and criminality. Emails, recordings, and testimonies came one by one, each stripping away the polished image he had once paraded before the world. Melody sat in the third row of the courtroom, her posture calm, eyes steady, presence radiant with resilience. She wasn't there to gloat. She wasn't there to celebrate. She was there because survivors deserved to see what justice looked like, not always as revenge, but as recognition. Vanessa sat beside her, fists clenched, jaw tight. When Melody was called to testify, the courtroom held its breath. She wore a charcoal gray suit, minimal makeup, and a pendant Jaden had made her with the word "brave" carved into it. The attorney asked her not just about the public humiliation, but about the manipulation that preceded it, how Liam had gaslit her, dismissed her dreams, and weaponized her mental health background as a weakness. "He didn't break me," she said clearly. "But he tried to convince me that I was already broken." Her voice did not tremble. Her story did not falter. The jury listened in pin-drop silence. Her words were more than testimony, they were truth dressed in armor. On the way out of the courtroom that day, a young intern stopped her and whispered, "I hope my future looks like yours." Melody smiled. "Then make sure your present never apologizes for being strong." In the days that followed, other key witnesses stepped forward. Alec Byrne testified with records, source code, and internal memos Noelle thought had been deleted. A former intern, Shyla Mendoza, recounted how Noelle had threatened to blacklist her if she spoke about the data logs. And then came the most unexpected moment. Gerald Callahan, Liam's father, took the stand. His statement was not scripted. He looked at his son, then turned to the court. I raised a man to win. I didn't teach him what to do when winning costs you your soul. His voice cracked. I failed him. But he failed himself more. Liam stared down, unblinking. The silence after Gerald's words felt heavier than any verdict. The trial stretched for 2 more weeks. When the final verdict was read, guilty on all major counts, Liam sat motionless, his expression unreadable. The courtroom buzzed with relief, not rage. Justice had not roared. It had whispered. Outside, the sky finally opened, and rain began to fall, not as a curse, but as a cleansing. Melody stepped out into it, head raised, letting it wash over her. Vanessa handed her an umbrella, but she declined. Let it rain, she said. I'm not hiding anymore. And as the courthouse behind her faded into distance, the woman once mocked, discarded, and broken walked forward, free. The weeks following the trial passed like slow-moving echoes, reverberations of a storm that had lost its thunder but left the wreckage behind. Liam Callahan was remanded to a federal holding facility pending sentencing. The once revered innovator who once stood on magazine covers now stood in line for cafeteria trays, sharing space with men who barely remembered his name. But isolation brought clarity. The silence of his cell became a mirror, reflecting back every smug decision, every manipulative smirk, every moment he traded intimacy for control. He replayed the speech he gave on national television, the sneer in his voice as he mocked the only woman who had ever truly seen him. And he hated himself, not because of the consequences, but because deep down, he realized that power had never made him whole. It had made him hollow. One morning, he received a letter. There was no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable, Melody's. It wasn't long. Just a few lines, I forgive you. Not because you asked, but because I refuse to carry your poison any further. May you find yourself in the silence. He read it 5 times before tucking it under his pillow. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But for the first time in a long time, Liam didn't feel like a man being punished. He felt like a man finally meeting the consequences of his choices. Gerald Callahan visited only once. The guards led him to the visitation room where Liam sat across from a plexiglass window, a phone in his hand, thinner than his father remembered. Gerald picked up the other receiver and stared for a long moment before speaking. You remember that summer you ran away from home? Liam gave a faint nod. I searched for you everywhere, Gerald said. But I never looked in the places where you were hurting. That's on me. Liam stared down at his lap, ashamed. Gerald sighed. I made you believe that proving yourself was the only way to earn love. And you believed it so hard, you destroyed everything trying to be enough. The silence between them was heavy. You don't have to prove anything anymore, son, Gerald added softly. Not to the world. Not even to me. Liam blinked hard. There were no hugs. No apologies. But there was something more honest than either, acknowledgement. When the guard called time, Gerald stood slowly, leaning on his cane. He tapped the glass once before walking away. Liam sat for a long time after, phone still to his ear, heart thudding against the cage he'd built around it. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't repair. But it was real. And sometimes, real was the only place healing could begin. Meanwhile, across town, Melody sat beneath a canopy of jacaranda trees outside the Haven Project, watching children paint on recycled boards for a weekend art therapy showcase. Vanessa was nearby, laughing with Jaden, who proudly showed off his clay sculpture titled My Family is Brave. Melody's heart swelled. Not with pride, but with peace. She had stopped trying to rewrite the past and had instead started building a future rooted in truth. She still had therapy sessions of her own, because healing wasn't a destination but a constant evolution. And in those sessions, she no longer spoke about Liam. She spoke about herself. Her growth. Her boundaries. Her joy. That evening, she hosted a private dinner for the volunteers and supporters of the Haven. Marcus arrived with a gift, a framed quote from their first podcast episode, "You are not what they did to you. You are what you choose to become after." Andrew helped string fairy lights across the courtyard, his eyes always finding melodies in the crowd. She hadn't chosen between them. She didn't need to. She had chosen herself. And in doing so, she had found a life more beautiful than any apology could offer. As the lights glowed above and laughter danced through the air, Melody looked around the courtyard, then up at the sky. It had taken everything falling apart for her to finally come full circle. But now she stood whole, not because of what she had lost, but because of what she had chosen to rebuild. The email arrived late on a quiet Sunday night as Melody sat cross-legged on her couch, surrounded by drafts of her upcoming book manuscript. The subject line read, UN Global Advocacy Fellowship, Invitation to Collaborate. At first, she thought it was spam. But as she read through the content, her breath caught. The United Nations Mental Health and Human Rights Council had been following her podcast and public engagements, and they were inviting her to serve as a guest advocate for a year-long global trauma recovery initiative. The role would require travel to various countries, Uganda, Jordan, Argentina, places where survivors, especially women and children, were still dismissed, silenced, or institutionalized for their pain. The opportunity wasn't just prestigious, it was purposeful. She stared at the screen for a long time, heart thudding. This wasn't about reclaiming status. It was about using her voice on a global scale. She picked up her phone to call Vanessa but paused. Instead, she called Dr. Karina Rojas. "Should I?" Melody asked softly. Karina didn't hesitate. "The world needs more voices like yours. Don't dim your light to make others comfortable." That night, Melody didn't sleep. She stayed up researching child trauma clinics in Argentina, schools in war-torn villages, and shelters for abused women across Eastern Europe. Her hands moved as if possessed, her soul awakened. She realized this wasn't a second chance. It was a calling. 2 weeks later, Melody flew to New York to attend the UN's preliminary roundtable. Among the attendees was Santiago Cruz, a documentarian and social justice advocate from Colombia whose films had uncovered child trafficking rings in South America. He was tall, thoughtful, with an unruly head of curls and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and survived it. Melody noticed how he didn't rush to speak, how he watched every panelist with deep reverence before offering his opinion. When she finally met him during the reception dinner, they found themselves seated beside one another by accident, or fate. "Your podcast helped me understand my sister better," Santiago said without preamble. She was always the strong one. But no one believed her when she finally broke. Melody looked at him, surprised. "She didn't break," she replied gently. She stopped pretending she wasn't in pain. They spoke for over an hour that night, not about politics or policies, but about people, wounds that didn't bleed but burned, voices lost in translation, and cultures where suffering was expected but never acknowledged. Santiago pitched an idea before they parted, a joint film series titled Invisible Bruises, a global account of survivors who never got a platform to speak. Melody said yes before she even thought about it. She didn't need time. She just needed truth. And Santiago spoke the same language. Back home in Seabrook, life adjusted again. Vanessa beamed with pride at Melody's new appointment but also expressed concern. "Don't lose yourself in fixing the world," she said one night over tea. "You already saved 1,000 souls. Don't forget to keep yours safe too." Melody promised to pace herself, to create boundaries, and most importantly, to choose joy without guilt. Marcus, ever the steady friend, offered to help manage her speaking requests while she traveled. Andrew, in his quiet way, kept volunteering at the Haven, painting murals that children now pointed at with hope in their eyes. Melody never made declarations about her love life. She simply allowed connections to unfold, honoring each relationship for what it offered. Marcus gave her laughter. Andrew gave her reflection. Santiago offered vision. And she, in turn, gave herself permission not to choose immediately. For once, she was no longer defining herself through love or loss, but through purpose. As she packed for her first trip to Uganda, she tucked a child's drawing into her suitcase. It read in crayon, "Thank you for helping me talk." It reminded her why she began. And as her plane lifted off the tarmac, Melody closed her eyes, not to escape, but to embrace the path ahead, an alliance not of politics or fame, but of healing. She was no longer rising alone. She was carrying thousands with her. It was a crisp morning in Lisbon when the Interpol task force surrounded a luxury hotel near Praça do Comércio and apprehended a woman checking out under the name Sophia Lake. The arrest stunned the European media and sent shockwaves back to the United States. Sophia was quickly confirmed to be Noelle Stanford, former assistant and now fugitive co-conspirator in the KlSSED scandal. She was escorted through a sea of flashbulbs, face hidden behind dark glasses and a scarf, but there was no hiding from the charges: fraud, wire tampering, money laundering, and international identity falsification. Her capture made headlines globally, not just for the crimes, but for the symbolism. The once smirking woman who stood beside Liam during his televised betrayal of Melody was now being labeled as the architect of deception by multiple financial crime units. And perhaps the cruelest irony was that her betrayal of Liam went deeper than anyone realized. Bank records showed she had been siphoning off funds months before their public partnership began. The media dubbed it the double collapse, a corporate empire destroyed not just by ego, but by mutual treachery. Liam was informed of Noelle's arrest through a folded note slid across a prison cafeteria table. He read the name 3 times before folding it again and tucking it into his pocket. He didn't speak. He just stared ahead, jaw tight, haunted. Back in Seattle, KlSSED officially filed for bankruptcy. Assets were frozen, intellectual property was revoked, and the brand was blacklisted from major digital platforms. Liam's name became a cautionary tale in business ethics courses across the country. Every news special about corporate downfall featured a segment titled "The Speech That Sparked It All," where the infamous televised kiss and mockery played on loop as analysts dissected the anatomy of self-destruction. Melody, though no longer attached to him legally or professionally, found herself mentioned in nearly every article, but not as the victim. As the Phoenix. Invitations for interviews flooded in. Publishing houses competed for her memoir rights. Documentarians fought for access. But Melody chose one, Marcus Wade. She entrusted him with the docuseries, not for fame, but because she knew he would tell it truthfully. Together, they launched Haven, the story of every woman. It didn't focus solely on her. It chronicled survivors around the globe, from shelters in Kenya to recovery groups in Tokyo. The final episode ended not in tears, but in applause. A standing ovation at an international screening in Geneva closed the series. And when the lights came up, the crowd chanted her name, not because she was perfect, but because she was proof that dignity, once stolen, could be reclaimed. Melody's legacy was no longer built on what she'd endured, but on what she had built. The Haven Project expanded to 3 countries within a year: Greece, Brazil, and South Africa, each one operating with local therapists trained in trauma-informed care and culturally sensitive healing practices. She declined positions in government and turned down corporate consulting gigs. "I'm not here to fix policies," she said in one speech. "I'm here to remind people they deserve peace." Her book, Unwritten Scars, debuted at #1 and became required reading in multiple universities. In her quiet town of Seabrook, a mural of her painted by Andrew stood outside the community center, with words written in 50 different languages: "You matter." Vanessa became a full-time operations director for the Haven. Jaden, now 12, wrote an essay for school titled "The Woman Who Taught Me Strength," and his teachers shared it online. It went viral. And Liam? His final sentencing gave him 7 years in federal prison with no parole. His only visitor was his father, who brought him the printed memoir Melody had authored. Liam held it in his hands for hours. The man who once silenced a woman to elevate himself now held the story that the world listened to instead. It was a full-circle reckoning. And Melody, watching the sun rise over her garden, didn't smile in triumph. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Legacy isn't what they remember when you're gone. It's what they become because you lived." The soft rhythm of ocean waves greeted the morning as Melody stood barefoot on the warm sand of Seabrook's shoreline. The sun had just begun to rise, casting golden streaks across the water, and the scent of salt hung in the air like memory. Behind her, the newly completed Haven Retreat Center stood nestled among cedar trees, a serene extension of her original vision. Unlike the main project's urban centers, this retreat was designed for rest, not therapy, for healing that happened not in sessions, but in silence, and sunlight, and laughter, and stillness. It had taken years, but she had made it. She had transformed tragedy into purpose, humiliation into power. Melody wasn't defined by Liam's betrayal. She wasn't even defined by survival anymore. She was something else entirely, free. As she watched the waves crash gently along the shore, Jaden came running up behind her, barefoot and beaming. "Auntie Mel, come see. We finished the treehouse." Vanessa called after him, laughing, holding a tray of orange juice and granola bowls. Melody smiled wide, the kind of smile that came from the marrow, genuine, whole, and unburdened. She took Jaden's hand and said, "Lead the way." Later that afternoon, a quiet gathering took place in the retreat's garden. It wasn't an event, it was a celebration of peace. The guest list was simple: survivors who had once walked through the original Haven's doors, now returning as volunteers, donors, or simply to say thank you. Karina Rojas flew in from New York, gifting Melody a rare book of ancient healing practices. Marcus arrived with a camera slung over his shoulder, but he wasn't filming, he was simply present. Andrew brought handmade journals for the women in residence, each with watercolor designs that reflected the earth, sky, and resilience. And Santiago Cruz, fresh from filming the final segment of Invisible Bruises in Southeast Asia, surprised everyone by walking into the garden during Melody's toast. "I told you I'd return," he said with that familiar quiet warmth. Melody's eyes welled, not out of confusion, but clarity. These people around her, they were not chapters. They were constants. She raised her glass and said, "This isn't the end of a journey. It's the beginning of the world we needed but were told didn't exist. It does now. We built it." Applause rose, not thunderous, but full, alive, and real. And for the first time, Melody let herself believe that she was no longer healing. She was healed. As twilight settled and fairy lights danced across the courtyard trees, Melody sat beneath the wisteria canopy journaling quietly, her ritual, her grounding. But this time, there were no pain entries. No wounds to analyze. Just moments captured. Jaden smiled without hesitation today. Vanessa laughed so hard she spilled her drink. Santiago danced with the children barefoot. She closed the journal and looked up at the stars slowly emerging. Legacy wasn't just about what she built. It was about who she became while building it. Somewhere in a prison cell, Liam Callahan likely held her book, maybe for comfort, maybe for reflection, but he no longer owned any part of her narrative. Melody no longer needed an apology. She had rewritten the ending. She stood, dusted off her dress, and walked to join the others by the fire pit. Jaden sat on Marcus's lap roasting marshmallows. Santiago was telling a story about a boy who learned to speak after years of silence. Vanessa leaned on Andrew's shoulder, her laughter lighting the night. And in that moment, Melody felt it, not a memory, not a goal, but a truth: she was no longer a survivor. She was a beginning, for others, for herself, for hope. As the fire crackled behind her and stars blinked overhead, she whispered into the breeze, "I am still here. And this is just the start." The end.